Today's a great victory. It's a great victory for Sean Combs. It's a great victory for the jury system. You saw that the Southern District of New York prosecutors came at him with all that they had. They're not stopping, but one thing stands between all of us and a prison, and that is a jury of 12 citizens.
Diddy may have been acquitted of some pretty big charges at his criminal trial, but he still was convicted of 2. So what's next for him in terms of sentencing, his finances, facing a wave of lawsuits, including a brand new one from a former exotic dancer who claims Diddy drugged and assaulted him, caused him to lose teeth and have to get gastric surgery?
The courtroom was suffocating in silence. The kind of silence that grips everyone in the room and forces them to hold their breath. The cameras were outside, flashing like wildfire, but inside it was stillness. Every eye was on Sean Diddy Combs. The once celebrated mogul, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, was sitting in a chair that no one ever imagines themselves sitting in.
After the monumental verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial, the question now is, what is next for him, right? You got sentencing, civil suits, a lot to get into. So while Combs was acquitted of racketeering conspiracy and the sex trafficking charges that he was facing, he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution. Currently, sentencing is set for October 3rd. However, there is a hearing set for July 8th where the defense will be arguing for the sentencing date to be expedited, to happen sooner. Obviously, they want that, considering Combs was also denied bail yet again, despite arguments from his legal counsel after the verdict that he should be released on bond. It didn't happen. They want to make sure this happens as quickly as possible. But what will he be sentenced to, really? That's the question. And also, will the government seize his assets? What about all of those civil lawsuits that he faces? Again, a lot of questions, a lot to get into. So for all of this, let me bring on former sex crimes prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, the great Matt Murphy is with us. Matt, good to see you.
Happy to be here, as always.
Got to ask you your reaction to the verdict. Is it what you expected?
Well, hearkening back to, I don't know, we were talking about this, you and I, a couple of months ago, and I got to say, you know, whether it's fun to be right or not in a case like this, we were both right. This was never a good fit for RICO for a lot of different reasons. And the consent element regarding the sex trafficking was always problematic. And I thought the prosecution here did a good job presenting their case. They did a good job presenting their theory. But when you match in a trial context, when you match like professorial and kind of plotting, which is the way a lot of government lawyers are, versus dynamic and engaging and that personality of the defense, it's always a mismatch. You're always up against it. And the Mann Act, like we talked about, I thought he was going down on that after like the second day of testimony. The problem is for the prosecution, the Mann Act is a very old law, and it was essentially legislative morality from about 100 years ago, where it was transporting prostitutes across state lines. The intent may have been good. It was essentially a very early version of sex trafficking, but it was really more an attempt to stop prostitution, which is, as we know, never going to happen. So almost every lonely guy in New York City who's going through a divorce, who is having a problem in the dating pool, who has some sex worker drive over from New Jersey, if he buys her Uber or his Uber, theoretically, that's a violation of the Mann Act. So that is it's not the same type of crime. There's no mandatory minimum under federal law. The judge does not have to. That. Right. They don't have to. Now, it carries up to 10 years per event. So he faces up to 20 years. The prosecution, I think, is asking for 46 months or something like that. They're asking for far less than that.
If they had called, let's say, Christina Quorum, okay, this chief of staff who had been mentioned, I think, by almost every witness, and she said, hey, listen, there was a criminal enterprise, okay? We were all a part of it. Everybody knew what the job description was. My job was to do this. His job was to do this. You think they would have gotten racketeering? If they didn't include Jane, who was arguably the more problematic testimony, I mean, Sean Combs still paying her rent, messages that she was setting up a lot of these sexual encounters. Cassie had messages too that were problematic that showed if we're talking about whether she was a willing participant or not. But if you focus just on Cassie and you didn't call in Jane, or you didn't call in a Mia, or you didn't call in a Brianna Bengolan, if you limited the case, and now it's so easy to play, Monday morning quarterback.
Not as a guest, not as an observer, but as the man on trial, waiting to hear how many years of his life would be taken from him. The doors swung open, the judge entered, and the room rose. That single moment felt heavier than steel. Diddy's eyes twitched. His hands tightened around each other. His lawyers whispered. But nothing could ease the weight of what was coming. His arrogance, the swagger he had shown throughout his career, was gone. What sat there wasn't the Diddy the world had known on music videos and red carpets. What sat there was a man about to be broken by reality. The judge's voice carried across the room with a sharpness that cut through the air. No theatrics, no wasted words. Just a steady recitation of the charges, the evidence, the testimonies, and the law. Every word felt like a nail in the coffin.
Back or armchair lawyer here, but do you feel that the prosecution could have won this case if they structured it differently, if they called different witnesses?
That's a great question, and that's something that these prosecutors will literally be wondering for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. They're going to be wondering if they'd done it differently, would the impact upon the jury and would the result have been different. The fundamental problem, I think, is that this was kind of always a round peg in a square hole. The arson, that domestic violence video that we all watched, that's horrific. All of that should have been prosecuted as state crimes in Los Angeles. That as a fundamental, starting point.
Well, they couldn't
So
do it now. It
basically,
was time barred.
No, of course, the statute is run on everything.
Yep.
But that would have been, he would have been prosecuted for exactly what he did instead of predicate acts into a RICO theory. Now, RICO, as we know, was designed for essentially mafia organization, for organized crime. And the idea is simply because there's a legitimate business, like in The Godfather, they had a legitimate olive oil importing business, and that was but it was still a criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that, and the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole thing started, and and the jury, this was a sober jury that the questions were serious and direct, and they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning, saying, "Hey, this guy's not deliberating," and so this was a serious group, and the Mann Act, they did convict on that, so they were. By the fact that that it was unanimous meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have. They draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rules. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote, and you tend to get a more serious class of juror in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just like the sex trafficking, sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape. Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here, especially when you're talking about all these people who they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million, as a result of her settlement, right? And that
Yeah.
was a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? You know, what's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages, the conduct that arguably contradicts someone being.
Diddy blinked hard, his lips quivered, his head lowered, but the judge never flinched. He moved closer and closer to the moment that would seal Diddy's fate. Then it came. The announcement. The sentencing. Not months. Not probation. Not community service. Not a slap on the wrist, as many had whispered he might get because of his fame and money. Number. The judge's words rolled off his tongue with the weight of finality. Years in prison. Years stripped from his life. Years taken from the man who once believed he was untouchable. The sound of those words crushed the room. Gasps broke through the silence. Some supporters sobbed openly, their faces buried in their hands. Others sat frozen, unable to believe that the man they had defended, the man they admired, had just been given a punishment so severe. Even critics who had demanded accountability sat stunned, because the reality was heavier than any.
A victim, and I know there's complicated factors between an abuser and a victim, the trauma. I get it. I totally understand it, but I wonder if that's what saddled the jury. Okay, I want to move past the verdict because now we have to talk about what's happening next. First thing, when the sentencing hearing is going to happen. So they have this hearing next week about whether to expedite the sentencing, happening before October 3rd. If both sides agree, great. If they don't, what is a compelling legal argument for the defense to say, we want this sentencing to happen much sooner?
Well, I mean, we know that behind the scenes, what they want, of course, is they expect a chance that he's going to be released. So that's their big motivating factor, of course. Whether the court abides by that, I mean, it is a substantial change in circumstance. He was acquitted of all of these serious charges, right?
But he was
Like
just denied bail. He was denied bail again.
he was denied bail again, and I watched. I actually learned that on your segment yesterday afternoon as I was sort of
Yeah.
doing my my preparation for this. But we have to remember that one of the things that he got in trouble for, that Diddy got in trouble for in jail, was using other inmates' calling number. Remember that? So he was calling witnesses in the case from jail using other inmates. That was a direct affront to that judge. That was remember, we had all those attempts at bail that were denied at the very beginning of the case, one after another after another. This judge, and it's the same judge who's going to sentence him, denied that over and over again. And you and I, again, in another conversation we had on your show, we both said he is screwed now, that he's got no chance because he's violating the rules of the court while in jail. So if he's disobeying the rules of the jail and the directive of the court while he's in custody, how can he be expected to actually follow the terms of a bail agreement when he's out of custody?
Right.
And I think that chicken is coming home to roost again. I mean, I think that's what happened yesterday afternoon. That any judge who has a criminal defendant who behaves like that is an affront to the court itself. It's disrespectful to the court. And it's almost like he couldn't get out of his own way there at the beginning. But he had an excellent defense team.
He does. So assuming for a moment, whenever the sentencing hearing happens, right? Let's say it happens in a month from now. Let's say it has October 3rd. The question is, what's his sentence? As we mentioned, the prosecution in a filing from yesterday talked about the guidelines range being 51 to 63 months. Now, this is before a pre-sentencing investigation and report. Now, the defense, right, they want 21 months. He's already served almost 10. Talk to us about what you're thinking here, because there is no minimum. The maximum's 10. If the judge were to combine it together, like you said, 20 years, feels highly unlikely that would happen. As we're taught, what is a pre-sentencing report investigation? How would it affect this? What do you think the judge is going to do? There's so many different factors to consider here, and it's not like a murder case when it's like, okay, we know what's going to happen. It's like life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a given. There's room here. What do you think the judge is going to do?
So in federal court, this is actually very interesting. They rely very heavily on those pre-sentencing investigations. So essentially what will happen is there'll be a federal probation officer, and they do these for almost every case, where they will do their own investigation where they'll talk to family members, they'll talk to employers, they'll talk to neighbors, and they will make a recommendation to the court as to suitability for release, suitability for time. And that's something that federal judges traditionally really adhere to. They tend to put a lot of weight on those, far more than they do in state court.
Prediction. Diddy's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, his chest heaved, his face fell, his lips trembled, trying to stay composed. But the mask cracked wide open. He leaned back in his chair, almost as if his body couldn't hold the weight of the years that had just been handed to him. This wasn't the brash mogul who boasted about being above the system. This wasn't the party-throwing icon who paraded wealth and power like armor. This was a man cornered by truth, caged by justice, and crushed by the simple, brutal words of a judge. The gavel struck. The sound was like thunder in the silence. And just like that, it was done. No more speculation. No more rumors. The sentence was official. Sean Diddy Combs would spend years in prison. His lawyers slumped. His family broke down. And he sat there, his mind spiraling into the cold realization that his freedom was gone. The scene outside was chaos.
The prosecution at one point had said it's not fair, right? He's a wealthy celebrity who's providing a bail package that other people in his similar position wouldn't be able to provide. Now, the defense was like, well, the only reason we're presenting a package like this is because of what he's accused of and his wealth and his resources. We have to address that in a certain way. The reason it's so extensive is because of his wealth and resources. That bail package that was put forward was rejected by the court. What did you make of that?
Well, at that time, the judge was looking at the RICO Act and sex trafficking. So, Puffy was looking at possibly 25 years, or more, depending on what the guidelines were based on if he was convicted. So at 55 years old, at that time, it's almost a life sentence. So, and he has a lot of wealth and he had a private plane. So the judge was looking at that. Plus, in the federal system, they look at danger to the community. Where in the state system, they're not allowed to look at that. They look at risk of flight. So I think with all the letters behind that were coming in that we were not really privy to from a lot of the alleged victims, I think the judge made a decision that, hey, this is not going to be sufficient enough. I thought that at the end, he kind of, when we brought it on our private security team and we showed him who was going to be doing it, we did Sam Bankman-Fried. So we knew that, we would be completely covered on that end. And we gave him the idea of there would be no Wi-Fi in the building that we were looking at, and that he would not be able to really be able to connect with anybody but his legal team and his family. We thought at that point that maybe we had a chance, but at the end, the judge denied it, and that's where we stood. And now on this case coming forward, after the convictions, after he wasn't convicted, at the end, we didn't know what he was going to do. So, when Mark reached out to me afterwards, we started thinking about putting another bail package together.
And what is that bail package and by the way, is this a bail package that you think could be submitted again even after the judge just denied bail?
Well, the judge denied bail based on the statute, and the statute stated a certain amount of information that part of the Mann Act that, was not eligible for bail. There are certain circumstances that can be done. We're going to regroup again. I know that they were going to go talk to Mr. Combs again and see what happens there. They have the October 3rd date. And, I don't know where he stood. As of the other day, he wanted to get out. I don't think anybody wants to be at MDC where he is. So, we're going to reconvene and see what happens, at a later date. We could go back with another package.
Would it require him to stay in New York? Would it be him to be, I know he wanted to go back to his property in Miami, Florida. And there's also an interesting question, I think, that his defense put forward. He just got his life back. That's what they said. He wasn't convicted of the top charges. He was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution, but he would be a fool to try to violate any of those conditions when potentially he may get a rather lenient sentence compared to what he was facing. So two questions there. Do you think that it would require him to be in New York as opposed to Florida? And do you think that you think he'd really be in a position to violate the conditions?
First question is, I can't determine what a judge is thinking. I don't think, and this is my opinion, that the judge would let him out of the jurisdiction. I don't know. We can do private security down in Miami. We could also do private security in California, as we did with Sam Bankman-Fried. I would probably.
Reporters screamed questions into microphones. News alerts screamed across every platform. Social media erupted into a storm of celebration, disbelief, rage, and shock. Hashtags trended worldwide. Some called it justice finally served. Others wondered how a man who had stood so high had managed to fall so far. Some refused to believe it, clinging to conspiracy theories. But the truth was simple. The judge had spoken, and no amount of denial could erase it. For Diddy, the sentence was more than years behind bars. It was the death of the image he had spent decades building. The lavish parties, the expensive cars, the designer suits, the power moves in boardrooms. All of it crumbled in a single moment. Because years in prison meant he wasn't a mogul anymore. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't the man calling the shots. He was an inmate.
We think that if the judge would think about possibly a package, that he would want us to keep him here. When we first put the first package together, going a few months back, we did have an apartment here in the city that I did scout out and located a brownstone in New York that was sufficient enough, which we thought, which was one entrance in, one entrance out, for our security to be there, and no rooftop, couldn't get out from any of the windows. So we could always go back and see if that's still available. I don't know if it is or not. So I can't determine what a judge is going to think. I don't think he would let that happen if he decided to make bail, but you never know. This judge was very fair to both sides in the trial. And as far as would he want to screw up what he, after being, the convictions not coming through, I think you got to be dumb to do something like that.
Right.
He is going to possibly get his life back. I don't know what's going to happen in the music world. I don't know what's going to happen in his regular life, but he's not facing the time that he was facing before that.
And I'm going to talk about sentencing a little bit later on. The private security, right, that would monitor him 24/7. The argument could be, and this is something the prosecution's put forward, how can we trust that he's not just they're not bought and paid for, they're not really gonna watch him if he's hiring them, there's a conflict of interest there. What's your response to that?
My team is ex-law enforcement, all gentlemen that have been involved either in the Marshal Service, FBI, police, even some CIA. So again, my people would not risk their lives on something or risk their reputation or even possibly a criminal charge on something like this. So my guys are vetted. They've been doing this a very long time. So they wouldn't jeopardize anything like that. Now, when we first talked about private security, Puffy wanted some of his people. We denied that right away. It's our guys. It's my reputation on the line here. And that's when I went to court and Tony Rico and Mark Agnifilo both stood up and said, hey, Mr. Judelson is, his reputation's on the line here. He's been doing this a long time. I've bailed out Harvey Weinstein, Conor McGregor, Plaxico Burress, Cat Williams, Lawrence Taylor. So, I'm not going to put my reputation or my license in jeopardy, for X amount of money. To me, I'm going on. I might want to turn this business over to my son one day.
Yeah, the New York Times did a profile on you called Bailing Out the Stars. How are celebrities different? How are they different from other criminal defendants?
More demanding. When you get the phone call from the lawyer or whoever, a publicist, anybody, it could happen in the middle of the night. A celebrity does not want to spend an extra minute incarcerated. Things change so drastically with, when I did Conor McGregor, he surrendered, he wanted out right away. Plaxico Burress, when that happened, we were talking and Mayor Bloomberg was involved allegedly in
a system he thought could never touch him. He had built his empire on the illusion of invincibility. But when the judge handed down those years, the illusion shattered completely. Fame couldn't save him. Money couldn't save him. Influence couldn't save him. And when the system finally decided to close in, it didn't blink. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about humiliation. For Diddy, prison meant not just losing his freedom, but losing control. Every meal, every movement, every second of his life would be dictated by someone else. The man who once commanded armies of staff and entourages would now line up with other inmates. The man who once threw parties for the elite would now eat on a tray under fluorescent lights. The man who once boasted about being untouchable would now be searched, monitored, and locked away. The years stretched out before him like an endless
while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or
road. And Diddy knew it. He could see it in his eyes as the sentence echoed in his head. Days turning into months. Months turning into years. Birthdays missed. Families slipping away. Business ventures abandoned. An empire decaying while he sat in a cell. The reality was harsher than anything he had ever faced. This wasn't a scandal he could spin. This wasn't a rumor he could silence. This wasn't a lawsuit he could settle quietly. This was a prison sentence carved into law, undeniable, irreversible, devastating. The fall from grace was complete. A man who once defined himself by luxury, success, and dominance now defined himself by failure, downfall, and disgrace. The courtroom that day became the stage of his ultimate undoing, the final curtain on the life he once paraded so loudly. And the world was watching. The same world that once cheered his rise now dissected his fall. His name, once synonymous with power, was now forever linked to downfall. His story, once told as inspiration, was now a cautionary tale. His empire, once built to last, was now just a fragile memory crumbling under the weight of reality. The words seemed to hang in the air like thunder. Years behind bars. Not months. Not probation. Not a slap on the wrist. A years-long prison sentence. The kind of punishment that would strip away the last fragments of freedom and dismantle whatever remained of his once glamorous empire. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Supporters buried their faces in their hands. Even some of his critics, who had called for justice for so long, sat stunned by the sheer weight of the decision. Diddy's face told its own story. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, his lips trembled as if he was fighting back tears. For a moment, the mask of arrogance he had worn for decades shattered completely, leaving behind a man confronted with the harshest reality of his life. This was not the Diddy who strutted across red carpets, who hosted star-studded parties, who boasted of being untouchable. This was a man facing years in a cell, stripped of power, stripped of luxury, stripped of everything he once used to define himself. The judge's gavel came down, and just like that, the case was closed. The sentence was official. Sean Diddy Combs would spend years in prison. And outside the courtroom, the world erupted. Headlines blared across every news outlet. Social media exploded with reactions. Some celebrated, calling it long overdue justice. Others expressed shock that a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in entertainment had finally been brought down so completely. For Diddy, the road ahead is darker than ever before. Years behind bars means years away from his family, his businesses, his fame. It means a legacy forever scarred by scandal and downfall. And while he may still fight appeals, while his lawyers may try to spin the narrative, one fact cannot be denied. The judge's decision marked the harshest reality Diddy has ever faced. For years, Diddy acted as if he was untouchable. But in that courtroom, when the gavel fell, the truth was undeniable. No one is untouchable, not even him. And now, with years of prison life stretching ahead of him, Sean Diddy Combs faces the harshest reality yet. A life reduced to bars, walls, and silence, with nothing but time to think about how it all came crashing down. The gavel didn't just sentence him to years in prison. It sentenced him to face himself, to sit in the wreckage of his empire, to live with the reality that the world he built, the image he sold, the life he flaunted, is gone. Because in the end, all the fame, all the fortune, all the power, it wasn't enough. The judge's words erased it all. And the years ahead will be the ultimate reminder that when justice comes, it comes without mercy. Sean Diddy Combs now has nothing left but time. And time is the harshest punishment of all.